All right, good. Yes, it's good evening, everybody. So I'm gonna ask if one of you could kindly help us by oh, I see there's a thumbs up. Thank you, Isaac. You know, I'm experimenting with a whole range of things here, and my worry is as I'm twisting around some things like attendance seemingly maybe broken. And so what I'm going to do, because I don't think I'm able to take attendance from this account. I don't have the plugin I normally use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to exit from I'm going to exit from the account I'm currently logged on. It's a different Google Workspace account, and then I'm going to log into the other one, and hope that this thing is not going to break apart when I do that. So I will see if I can exit from. This is very strange here because I'm attempting to log in on my mobile device, my phone, but I seemingly have a range of. I apologize. I have a range of different meetings that are currently active and all those things. It's quite strange here, but so I'm going to exit from here because I'd much rather log in using my UNZA signed in. And then I'm going to again ask if one of you could just confirm if you can hear me just fine, if there's nothing wrong with the audio. Thank you very much. All right, it's been a while, everybody. The last couple of days I've been busy, quite busy, and yeah, quite busy. So, but we're supposed to have, I think, a session over the weekend or something, but we'll catch up. And unfortunately, right? So I think I'd mentioned to the course reps that that I had a meeting today. We went up to Z.ICTA. They are, I guess, our partners in this event that is taking place in the next few weeks. I don't know what this is here. You want to rejoin if you're going to be booted out. It says some people are going to be removed. Yeah, I don't know what that is here. So yeah, so I'm gonna have to apologize upfront. Tomorrow there's something that we're preparing. So I'm gonna kindly ask that we are moving. I want to ask that we move our class to 18 hours. Hope this makes sense. I'll ask the two course reps to just reach out to me if it's not possible, because if it's not possible, then I'm going to try to come in the morning or something. But I want to propose that we move this to 18 hours or something right after. I hope the other meeting that we have is not going to be there, but yeah. So there's that. Anyways, so a reminder here that we've gone into a stage where we started looking at the research methodology, right? And I believe the last interaction we had, I'm just going to play it back here and just have a sense of where it was. I think we were looking at, yeah, I don't know what this is here, but in the last interaction, we had got into a stage where we're looking at the different methodological aspects, right? And I hinted at the fact that we were going to, quote unquote, use the research onion. I don't know why this is it's the 30th. Must have met, but anyway, this is very strange here. Okay, yeah. So we're going into a stage where we were looking at that, And my goal really is I was wanting to I was trying to get us to a stage where we fully appreciate what the research methodological approach is all about, like the things that we tend to do as part of this, right? And I think one of the things I told you to do is to go and read through these case examples so that you're able to better understand the things that we're going to be talking about, right? So here's to hoping that people have found time to go through. I've been using this as an example quite often, the Wikipedia content contribution in Zambia. So hopefully you've gotten a chance to read up on this and tie the different bits and pieces together as they relate to the things we're discussing here, right? What else? There's a usability evaluation of university library portals in Zambia. The thing about this work is, so I was working with a master's student. We were co-supervising this master's student, Mr. Kowe Tembo. Mr. Kowe Thoma Tembo, she works for Zikas University. I think she's a deputy librarian there. And so we were co-supervising this individual together with Professor Kandelwa, some pretty interesting work she did there. It was actually, presented at a very prestigious venue, Africa, it's called. That was some 2 years ago or something. You may want to focus quite a bit on this particular, example, because this is one of those few research projects that I've worked on where there's no software development involved, right? So you're not developing any sort of system or software, right? And it's human-centric. So if you look at the range of studies that were done in here, like for instance, she makes mention of the fact that I don't know how much of this, but she makes mention of the fact that for instance, there was data collection associated with University of Zambia. Sorry, not University of Zambia, but different universities or something, right? Somebody was trying to call here. I was saying class will call back, or something like that. Yeah, so you probably want to find time and look at that anyway. And then I've used this as an example as well. Evaluating perceived workload, usability, and usefulness of those things, right? Anyways, so quite a number of examples I said, right? And what we said was that our discussion of this is best perceived from Sanders' so-called research onion, he calls it, where he represents the different methodological aspects that you take into account from the perspective of like peeling out the different layers of an onion or something, right? So it turns out that the methodology is supposed to have some kind of philosophical underpinning associated with it, and then you have like a research approach and research strategies, right? Data collection techniques or measurement instruments and all those things. So in essence, we discovered really early on in the process that research is supposed to be systematic, right? And systematic irrespective of whether you're looking at the introduction, the way that you organize your so-called research questions and your research objectives, the specific objectives, right? But also we realize when we're looking at the literature synthesis or literature review discussion that we also have to be systematic in terms of presenting in terms of describing existing literature, right? And it turns out that now that we're discussing the methodology, we also have got to be systematic in the way that we are presenting the methodology, right? So the so-called, I'm sure you've picked up on this already. There've been instances where I'm making reference to the research methodology or research design, right? I don't know, in some of the papers, actually, you've found subsections tagged as research design and all those things. In as much as sometimes they may be used interchangeably, but these are two different things. It's important that we appreciate the fact that these are two different concepts. So your research design is a plan for a study that provides the overall framework for collecting data. There's a thing here. You're providing a framework for collecting data. So in essence, when you're making reference to so-called research design, what you're doing is you're outlining a plan for things like, because when you're collecting data, what to indicate the target population, the sample size, the sampling techniques, right? Measurement instruments. So what you typically indicate as part of your research design are things to do with decisions made when selecting participants, study participants. Details of the study setting, where exactly this research is situated, and things like data collection techniques. So things like we used interviews or questionnaires, collect data or something, right? So that's your research design. Whereas the research methodology essentially just provides you with guidelines on how an inquiry should proceed, right? So you typically be outlining things like analysis and assumptions, and then principles and procedures for a particular approach that you've chosen. Now here's the thing. The easiest way of getting around this is to appreciate the fact that it's crazy here what's happening, but to appreciate the fact that typically your best bet is whether when you are writing, let's say, your manuscript, right, a long document, you are better off doing something like chapter 3 research. You can do this methodology. Whereas when you're writing, let's say, a short report, for instance, or an article, a journal article, something, what you do is you'd have something like research methodology, right, as a section. And then somewhere in your research methodology, you typically, and not that it's all the time, but to avoid this misrepresentation, to avoid a situation where people will be confused as what you're doing, just follow the traditional structure. Somewhere in your chapter 3, you'd have something like maybe 3.1 or 3.2, 3.1. Actually, 3.1 would be like research approach. And then 3.2 or something would be your, I can just delete this. 3.2 would be like your research design, right? If this is making sense here. And then in here as well, you'd have something like your 3.2 would be like your research design. Now, so in essence, it's almost like your research design is typically a part of the research methodology. Right? Don't misrepresent these things here. Another thing worth mentioning here is that if you have a situation where you're working towards a number of specific research objectives, and these research objectives will involve collecting data in a number of different ways, what you'd have to do is, because we are saying that your research design is a plan for a study, providing the overall framework for collecting data, if you're collecting data in different ways, typically what I advise students to do is you refactor the different ways. So you'd have like maybe, let's just say the methodology for research question number 1. Sorry, not the methodology, but the details of how data is going to be collected for research question number 1 and number 2 and number 3. You understand? It's a lot easier that way. Of course, I mean, you can structure research in so many different ways. I'm just saying it's a lot easier. And true to that, what we normally do, or if you've been paying attention and you've actually read through the documents that I've asked you to go and read, what you begin to notice is that in a number of papers where I'm co-author, like if I'm working with students, for instance, yeah, it's in 2024 though. Yeah, when I'm working with students, I would have something like like this, right? Where I hope we did this, where we have, maybe it's because of space, but typically in our methodology would explicitly indicate to say, and we may not have done this here because of space constraints or something. But typically what we'll do is, yeah, there we go. Thank you. So if you notice, we have the methodology, right, as section 3. And then we have 3.1 is the research design, okay? What did these guys do? I hope the final paper was not like this, but this is supposed to be 3.1.1, right? Because we are outlining the research design for this particular specific objective. You understand? So there's that anyway. So what we're saying is that these are typically they're misrepresented, but you typically be referring to two different things here when you're talking about the research design and the research methodology. Okay, and we see really that your so-called research design obviously is fundamental, right? It forms the fundamental framework for guiding the research, and it would typically include things like the philosophical underpinnings, right, or the methodological choices and any practical considerations that you'd have taken into account to conduct a very systematic and meaningful study, in other words. Okay. And really the design we see here is aligned with the overall research process, typically, right, where the idea about aligning the research process here is what is typically called the golden thread, right? So this idea that the ideas have got to be connected somehow. If you have 3 research objectives in the introduction, if you have 3 research objectives, right? Somewhere here you have research objective or research question number 1 and number 2, number 3. The idea is that there's got to be a connection of ideas in the research methodology. You've got to align the things that you're talking about with what is in the introduction. Okay. And part of the reason why you're doing this is, you know, when you're coming up with the research design, you are in part trying to ascertain important things like the resources that you're going to require for you to actually collect the data in this particular case, right? How many people you need? Are you going to have to recruit research assistants, for instance? You know, are you going to have to hire people to transcribe interviews if it gets to that, right? So it helps you with resource allocation, right? In essence, ensuring that you're utilizing your resources efficiently. So there's going to be a connection there. And so the design really essentially just provides a systematic approach to tackling a research problem, right? Fundamentally reducing any sort of bias and making sure that you're as accurate as possible. You can't be 100% accurate, in part because most of these are more or less like estimates, right? Guesstimates, if you can call them that. The other thing about the research methodology is it ensures that, because you're being rigorous here, it ensures that the research produces valid conclusions. Okay, not information that is marred with errors or something like that. Okay. Yeah. So some of the key elements here are things like the research philosophy. Typically, when you're talking about research design, research approach, sorry, research design, or a methodology, if you will, you typically have got to, not always all the time, but most instances, you typically have got to include these different things here. So you specify the philosophy, right? The philosophical underpinning of the study that you're conducting, or the approach that you've undertaken. The approach, which we've discussed at length. There are different philosophical underpinnings, and we'll briefly gloss over these. These are not really that important, but we'll just briefly talk about them. Yeah, so the research philosophy, the research approach, you talk about things like, you know, any sort of sampling strategies and data collection methods that you have utilized, and of course, the plan, a detailed plan on how you're going to analyze data. whether that data is qualitative or quantitative, you've got to come up with a plan on how exactly you're going to analyze the data. So in essence, your section 3 is usually it is expected that you're supposed to talk about these key things here. Okay. Anyway, so in terms of research philosophy here, typically, you know, when you're conducting research, you typically work using certain existing theoretical assumptions here. And in some instances, these theoretical assumptions, the assumptions they're working with, will be shaped by, you know, perhaps values that may be accepted within a particular society, culture, right, or discipline in some instances, right? These are sometimes referred to as paradigms, right, or a way of framing what we know. It's like, and that's the thing about this is when we started discussing this, we discovered that there are different ways of knowing, right? We can know things by going to people who we trust in society or something, experts, right? We go and talk to them and hope that we can trust what they're telling us, right? Or we can know things by being objective, is it? By collecting empirical data, for instance. Here's the thing: if I wanted to know your perceptions on 2034, for instance, I have different sort of options I can leverage, right? I can say, you know, I'm just going to talk to you, right? Maybe use interviews or something like that, and get your subjective views or something like that, right? Or I can collect data from a representative sample from you guys. If I'm interviewing you, it'll probably be sufficient for me to interview, let's say, maybe less than 10 of you or something, right? Assuming less than 10 of you would be a good enough sample to represent the various minors. But if I'm wanting to conduct a quantitative study where I'm going to use some questionnaire or something, I would have to collect data from a significantly larger sample size, because the goal there is to be objective, right? I want to make sure that whatever conclusions I'm going to draw are going to be informed by empirical data, in essence. The key thing here is we're trying to put it out there that there are different ways in which we can find out the truth, if you will. Right? So these are called paradigms or research philosophies. So some of the common ways of knowing, right, so far as research philosophy is concerned, would be things like positivism, for instance, interpretivism or pragmatism, for instance, right? And by the way, in case you're sitting there and you're wondering, but how do I know the research philosophy that's going to guide my research? Well, it depends on the people you're going to work with, the people who mentor you. For instance, I worked a lot with people in the science fields, right? People with background in mathematics, for instance, and computer science. And so most of the things we were doing when I was a master's student and PhD student, we are leaning more towards positivism, right? So this notion that the best way of knowing is to actually collect empirical data. So everything we were doing, right? You're collecting numbers. You're trying to narrow down to the truth by looking at the numbers. It's like, for me, and I still hold that view, actually, to be honest, even though I still do a little bit of like interviews and stuff. For me, if I want to find out whether I am whether perceptions of LIS 2034, right? Yeah, your perceptions of LIS 2034. The first thing I would do if I wanted to answer this question, right, is I would say I'm going to design a questionnaire and collect information. If I'm able to collect information, if I'm able to conduct a census and collect information for all of you, well and good, right? If I can't and I get a representative sample, that's, for me, that's far much better than so for me, using a questionnaire is far much better than conducting interviews, right? Because interviews are subjective. You know, I can't interview all of you, right? I'll reach a saturation point, they say. So what I'll do is I'll just, I'll probably single out a handful of you and then interview you. Now, the problem with that is the perceptions that you get from people are going to be subjective. there are certain nuances that you won't be able to take into account, right? So the validity of what you're doing becomes a bit questionable, if you will. You know, so the idea behind why I lean more towards empiricism, for instance, is because of my training, right? So what I'm trying to say is one of the reasons that would enable you to decide on what sort of approach you're going to take is obviously your training, right? In some instances, you could be forced because maybe you don't have resources, but again, many a times it could be influenced by the discipline. If you look at people in the science fields, right? I dare you to go and speak to colleagues of yours that are doing chemistry or biology or something. They probably don't even know that you can do research by collecting data using interviews, right? Because what they do there is, you know, they have measurements. You're mixing chemicals and you're measuring the quality of air or something. It's numbers, you know. Anyways, so there's positivism, right, which emphasizes the importance of objectivity, measurement, right, and things like quantitative data. So engineering, computer science, chemistry, most STEM fields actually would lean more towards positivism, right? And the idea is typically the aim or the end goal, right? When you take this approach, this paradigm here is you're interested in discovering things like causal relationships that exist. And what we begin to notice here is that this sort of research philosophy is normally associated with things like quasi-experiments, right? So controlled experiment or correlational designs, where you're trying to determine what sort of relationship exists between the different variables that you're working with. And this is what we do. Maybe we'll discuss this anyway, but this is what you do when you're designing a questionnaire. You say, I'm gonna collect gender, right? I want to know whether the respondents are male or female. I'm gonna gather their age. I'm gonna figure out maybe things like I don't know, the tribe or something. You're doing this because you're anticipating that there's going to be some sort of relationship between these different factors. These are independent variables with what you're measuring, right? In this case, it's perception. And typically, when you're trying to ascertain whether there's this sort of relationship that exists, what you're looking for are correlations, right? Not really causal factors. It's sort of like experiment aimed at determining causal factors here would be something you'd conduct after you establish correlations that exist. And then with interpretivism, the focus is on understanding subjective meanings and interpretations. We went to interview Lighton because he's an expert in teaching or something. And this is what he said. Of course, we just didn't speak to Lighton. We went and spoke to maybe Abel Mkulama or Yelambewe or something. And based on our the subjective responses we got from them as we were interviewing them, we're able to understand things a bit better or something. So the emphasis, right, with this philosophical underpinning is really on qualitative data. So content analysis, interviews, focus group discussions, right? Anyways, and again, we see that this sort of philosophy or paradigm is normally associated with things like if you're conducting a case study or an ethnographic study where you embed yourself in a particular environment to try and understand what goes on, for instance. And this brings us to the other reason why you choose one paradigm over the other, right? It's like the study design itself. If it's a case study design, you wouldn't want to conduct an experiment, for instance, anyways, and then there's also pragmatism, where you're looking at, trying to understand challenges with existing power structures or something, or inequalities. Again, this is mostly stuff that is done in the social sciences, right? So your goal here could be, maybe you're conducting a study where you're looking at empowering some marginalized group or something. And some classic examples of where you take a more pragmatic approach is if you're doing action research, for instance, or if you take a participatory design approach, right? participatory study where you are heavily relying on input coming in from participants in your study. Things like code design, for instance. But here's the thing. In as much as it's important for you to understand the research philosophy, in most instances, you tend to, at this stage, you tend to gravitate. In fact, most researchers will tend to gravitate towards either one of these two for most types of study. Right? Anyways. So that's the research philosophy. And again, here's the thing, right? To showcase to you that this is not really something that is very much focal point, if you will. I'm going to showcase to you what the UNZA does here, right? I don't know how much of this you remember here, but if you remember the regulations, they say philosophy or paradigm. I hope it's there. I hope it's there. I think in the part where we are looking at the structure of the proposal, I think it's a proposal. It is. I don't know how much of this you remember, but there was mention of certain types of things that you ought to include, right, in the proposal document. And what you'll notice is, I hope it's there, but the things to do with, I don't know if I'm looking at the theoretical grounding here, or I'm thinking about something else. I guess I was thinking about something else anyway. That's okay. Theoretical. I guess I'm thinking about, okay, I was thinking about the theoretical and conceptual framework, which is optional, right, for masters, but compulsory for PhD students. Yeah, but for these other things, I think it's required. I don't know if there's mention of the research philosophy in here. Probably not, but that's okay. Anyways, so that's that. And then in terms of the research approach, right? Ideally, there are three main types of research approaches. It's like techniques that you're going to utilize for you to collect data, right? There's a link between the obvious approach and the philosophy or the paradigm that you've adopted, but it's always expected that you explicitly indicate the research approach. In essence, the techniques that you're going to utilize for you to collect data, right? So three main approaches that you have. You have a so-called quantitative research approach, qualitative research approach, and the so-called mixed methods approach. Now, the idea behind quantitative research approach is you're in essence conducting a study that is primarily going to involve you collecting numerical data. And you're collecting numerical data because you are interested in quantifying some phenomenon. I want to understand students' perceptions of LIS 2034. You know, whether they understand LIS 2034 or not, and I'm taking a quantitative approach. What that means is that I'm going to have to collect quantitative data. So things like how many respondents are female, how many are male, I'm quantifying things, right? Those are numeric values. Things like to what extent, or what is the perception of, on a scale of 1 to 5, what are students' perceptions of LIS 2034? You notice that the way that I'm asking these questions, if you look at the dependent variables themselves, things like perception, I'm going to say perception is we're looking at measuring this particular variable by looking at a 5-point scale. You know, and the idea behind the scale is that, you know, if people are leaning more towards the left, then they're going to indicate a much lower scale than when they're leaning more towards the right or something. Positive versus negative, right? If this is making sense, yeah. And typically, you would conduct this quantitative studies here to test hypotheses. Again, back to the perception example, our hypothesis is that we're going to hypothesize that there isn't going to be any noticeable difference. There isn't going to be any difference between responses from females and males. And the goal there is I'm going to have to disprove that hypothesis, right? To say, is it actually going to be the case when we collect this data that there's no noticeable difference? Or are we ultimately going to end up with a situation where there's variations in the responses that we're getting from males and females, if that's making sense? So you conduct these sort of studies when you're doing those sort of tests, right? Hypothesis. When you're conducting a sort of hypothesis test, then you're conducting a quantitative study. Or if you're looking at establishing some sort of relationship, I don't know if that's a question here, or if it's I don't know if that's a hand up or something. If it's a hand up, please go ahead. Is that a hand up? I don't know. No, maybe it was just a method. I think a comment or something, a message somewhere. Right. So you're trying to establish relationships that exist, and this makes sense. If you're quantifying things, the simplest possible way of understanding this notion of establishing relationships is think of a typical questionnaire that you filled out, right? You almost always indicate dependent variables. So sorry, independent variables by way of demographic factors, for instance. The reason you do that, part of the reason you do that is you're trying to confirm, right? You're trying to confirm or to ascertain whether or not there's some sort of relationship that exists between the different variables. The same thing actually applies to the same thing actually applies to these other classic controlled studies, right? Like quasi experiments, for instance. You would have a situation where you go to the hospital. You probably haven't figured this out, but they're testing some drug. They're testing some drug, and they're interested in measuring the efficacy or the effectiveness of a malaria drug or something. One of the things they would do is, of course, they're going to capture a demographic, right? Because you know that age is a factor when it comes to drugs. This is why they say if you're an adult and you're taking paracetamol, take 2 tablets. But if you're less than, is it the age of 15 or 18 or something, take 1 tablet or something like that. But they'll be altering certain things, is it? Like the dosage, right? So maybe they'll recruit people and give them different dosage. So 1 tablet, 2 tablets per day, or 3 tablets per day, right? And then ultimately they'll be measuring something. It would be like recovery rate, for instance. Like how quickly do you recover from malaria, depending on the dosage. So in essence, what they'll be interested in this sort of study here is trying to establish what sort of if there's a relationship that exists between dosage and recovery rate. And typically, it's usually the case that there's usually a sweet point, right? An optimal number of pills that you have to take for you to quickly recover. If you take too much, maybe you have adverse effects, right? Reactions to some medication or something, right? So those sort of studies, the classic, it's a classic, I guess you can call it a quasi-experiment, a true experiment, if you will. That is a classic example of a study which is aimed at establishing relationships. Now, the different other example studies which are quantitative in nature that will lead you down the path of establishing relationships. Most of these surveys that are conducted will take into account this. The PrEP study, for instance, is a classic, right? That's one of the reasons why they were looking at programs. So if you look at their results, what you notice in their results is they probably draw conclusions based on programs, right? Maybe people in certain programs are more informed, right? So there's a relationship there, you know. Something else that is characteristic of a quantitative study here is you typically find yourself or you are conducting a quantitative study to measure variables. So these variables, if you remember our discussion of variables, there are typically different types of variables. The main types of variables we work with are independent variables and dependent variables, right? So what you'd be doing as part of a quantitative study is you're measuring these things, you're altering these different types of variables. gender, right? You're trying to see if there's a relationship between gender and performance. You're trying to see if you're going to measure things like number of times that somebody accesses Moodle versus how they perform, right? So measuring variables. Irrespective of how you're designing your survey, at some point you're going to be measuring these different variables, right? Those things we defined as independent variables, and control variables, for instance. The other thing that is characteristic of so-called quantitative studies is they will typically involve large sample sizes. So if you find yourself in a situation where you want to collect data from a large representative sample, in all likelihood, you will find yourself conducting a quantitative study. Now, I know large is relative in this particular case, right? It'll be like, what if if I'm collecting data from different tribes in Zambia, and there are 72 tribes, right? If there are 72 tribes, maybe you'd want to conduct interviews in such a way that you interview kids and adults from these 72 different tribes. So you notice that the sample size of the people you're going to be interviewing from the perspective of an interview may arguably be large, right? But what we are saying here in terms of large sample sizes here is relative to the population, you will find yourself collecting data from a significantly larger sample size. If I wanted to interview you guys, it would be sufficient for me to interview not more than 10 of you. If I wanted to collect data using a questionnaire, I would need to get a significantly larger sample size from amongst you. Probably somewhere in the above 50 or something like that. Why? Part of the reason, by the way, we discussed this is you're looking after what we introduce as statistical significance, right? This notion that you want to confirm that the results you've collected are not by chance, right? Anyways, so these things will typically involve large sample sizes. We collected data from, we collected responses using a questionnaire from 300 and we collected data from 346 students, right? From a population of about 4,000. If we were interviewing these people, we would not interview 346 students, right? We would interview a relatively smaller sample size there. And we will soon discuss this notion of saturation, right? If somebody ever asks you, how do you know when to stop interviewing people? You get to a point where the more you interview people, they'll be telling you the same things over and over again, right? You reach what's called a saturation point, if you will. Anyways, so it involves large sample sizes, and then it typically utilizes structured tools. So your measurement instruments are going to be structured. Structured in the sense that the items, for instance, in your questionnaire are more or less going to be the same. They'll be standard, right? Whether I am collecting data from Abel or Mulenga or Alex, it doesn't matter, right? They're all going to be, they're all going to use the same measurement instrument. However, if I'm interviewing them, right, the course of the interviews is in most instances would be dictated by the responses. So if I start talking to you and I realize that you're having challenges in this 2034, the conversation we're going to have is going to be different from somebody who doesn't have challenges. It's not structured like that. And also, you typically find yourself using structured tools like questionnaires or surveys and things like experiments, right? Where you see, when I'm conducting an interview here, I don't have to worry about how exactly I'm going to design my experiment so that I'm collecting the right information. But if, let's say, I'm interested in finding out if Lighton's teaching results in positive learning outcomes, what I would have to do here, one of the things I would have to do is I would have to design what's called an experiment, right? And the way you design an experiment is in such a way that you take into account all the possible things that can influence the results. Now, if you look at this idea of measuring whether Lighton teaching results in positive learning outcomes, the obvious thing that you probably have got to do is you say, we are going to get half of you, right? Teach half, or Lighton is going to teach half of you. And then we're going to get Mr. Mbewe, right, to teach the other half. So it's like we have two streams. From the beginning of the year in February, Lighton is going to be teaching like the way I'm teaching you right now. And then again, from the beginning of February, Pierre is going to be teaching you. Now, when we split you up in half, right, we're splitting you in such a way that, you know, we have sort of like a representation from all the important factors like gender, right? We have both males and females in both groups, and both groups have a mix of the different minors and the different majors and all those things, right? And then at the end, you're going to check if people that were taught in this group by Lighton, if more people, well, I'm using me here, right, because I'm measuring Lighton. If more people in Lighton's group, or rather, if the average pass rate in Lighton's group is greater, right, is greater than the average in Pierre's group, you then conclude to say, Lighton's teaching is more effective. What I would have done here is I've designed an experiment. Now when you're designing this experiment, right, there are other things to take into account. For instance, in this particular case, you wouldn't want to, well, I mean, you wouldn't want to maybe design you wouldn't want to design a study like this, right? It's like maybe you're disadvantaging other people. Perhaps Pierre is really good at teaching LIS 2034, and so in as much as we're interested in conducting this experiment, you'd much rather expose everybody to Pierre. Something else you could do is you could say, I'm going to design this study in such a way that we are going to, in this year, in the 2024/2024 academic year, Lighton is going to teach LIS 2034. And the next year, Lighton is not going to participate in LIS 2034, but then Mr. Mbewe, right, is going to teach LIS 2034. And then what you're doing here is you're measuring results in these different cohorts. So you're going to say, we're going to measure this year's cohort and see what is the average score, for instance. And it's not just the average score, by the way. You look at, you know, different things here, right? So, you know, your standard deviations and, you know, things like the arithmetic mean and the median values and all those things. And then you get the average from next year's cohort. This will be like 2025, 2026. You know, by the way, this is a design like what I'm explaining here from the perspective of like a true experiment, or quasi-experiment, is what they would call, this is what they call, no, these are all between. What I'm describing here, all of these are called between subject designs. So you're designing this experiment by comparing results from two different groups. In some instances, you can have the same group, right? So the way that you do this for the same group is you'd say, if you're dealing with the same group, it's called a within subject design. We're talking about experiments here. So for the same group, you'd say, beginning, we're going to use the 2024, you guys, right? Those of you that are enrolled into this. But what we're going to do is we're going to say, in term 1, Lighton teaches. And then in term 2, Pierre teaches. And then what you do in this particular case is you say, we're going to compare results from assessments in here and look at the average score and compare them with the results from here. This is from the same cohort. Now, what you begin to notice, right? And I guess we do have like some in-depth discussion of how we design this sort of experiments. But you begin to notice that it's not trivial for you to do this, because if you look at this within study design here, the first thing you should appreciate is the fact that the content that Lighton is teaching in term 1 is different, right? These are different topics. If you compare them from the topics that Pierre is teaching, so there's that stuff there. I don't know, maybe you can decide, so we're going to counterbalance, right? Maybe we'll have literature review. Lighton will teach the first half of literature review, and Pierre are going to teach the second half or something like that. So but anyway, we're not discussing designing experiments, 2 experiments. I'm just trying to hint at the fact that your quantitative research approach will typically involve such studies, right? Studies that use structured tools like surveys and experiments, right? Very rigid and strict. If you are measuring performance of some machine, a computer or something, you're conducting a quantitative study. The other characteristic of quantitative research approach is that you would typically have some sort of statistical analysis. So whenever you're collecting numbers, you will find yourself, and the easiest thing that students will do here in terms of statistical analysis is, we conducted descriptive statistics. So you have things like when we looked at the results of students in term 1 to compare with term 2, we saw that more males passed in term 1 compared to term 2, for instance. The mean score, right, or the average score in assessments was at 69% or something like that. The median value is, I don't know, 42% or something like that. The standard deviation is this, right? All of those things are to do with statistics. But it gets even better, right? Some other things that you do besides descriptive statistics is you do what's called inferential statistics. So this notion that you find yourself doing certain things to rule out the possibility that what you did was by chance. So you have things like we computed the mean average score to be 69%, and the p-value, we conducted a student t-test, and the p-value here was less than 0.05 or something. So we are concluding that the results were not by chance, something like that. Anyway, so you typically analyze data statistically, and this makes sense, right? If you think about interviews, I interview you and I transcribe the results. I mean, I'm not going to be drawing pie charts and bar plots there, right? When I interview you, I will get a transcript which is in audio form. I will transcribe it to text so that it's a lot easier for me to analyze. You will not find yourself doing any sort of statistical analysis there. Do you understand this? Anyway, just showcase an example here, measuring the effect of Lighton is teaching on test scores. A classic example of a quantitative study. I want to measure whether or not I'm effective at teaching 2034. Now, there's a thing here, right? You sit there and you think, maybe I may be effective, but maybe the way I set questions, I said hard questions or something. It's tricky, right? All those things. These are called variables, by the way. What I'm explaining are called variables, which is why some variables have got to be controlled. So say we are going to control the person who teaches, who is Lighton. He's teaching this year and next year, and we're going to measure the results or something. But it's tricky like that, right? Because when you start, you want to be careful here. This territory here can be tricky, right? If you're looking at measuring Lighton's effectiveness, my effectiveness may be perceived to be good now compared to maybe let's say 3 or 4 years ago. But guess what? What we have now is a lot of students cheating using ChatGPT. So you have this illusion that students are performing way better, when in actual fact, there are what we are calling confounding variables, right? So you have this illusion that students are performing better, but they're cheating a lot more or something. So it turns out that designing The point I'm trying to put across here is designing these true experiments or quasi-experiments is an art, actually. You take into account confounding variables, you counterbalance, right? You decide on whether you're going to conduct it within study design or within subject design or between subject design or something. I'm going to pause here. Next, when we meet tomorrow, we're going to look at qualitative research approach and mixed methods approach, right? And then we'll proceed like that. I'm going to pause here because I'm transitioning to a different class, but wanted to find out if there are any questions about about this. If not, yeah, next test is a schedule shared here. Last week of class, I've shared this already. It's the last week of class, which is the week of the 8th. This is when we have the test. Thank you very much, though. Can mixed methods approach incorporate positivism? Yes. Yes. I mean, if you look at our discussion of ways of knowing, I don't know if you were paying attention to this. We said that typically, when you're being objective here, you're taking a positivist approach, right? So to answer your question, mixed methods approach here, we're saying we're combining the best of both worlds, right? You know, you find yourself conducting an ethnographic study, but you also had a questionnaire, right? You're merging the two. So yes, you're incorporating the two. Colleagues, I will see you tomorrow. I'm gonna suggest that I'll ask Grevin to maybe email me or something because I'm transitioning to a different class. But reach out to the course rep. I may suggest that we meet early in the morning virtually still, because there's a meeting I'm attending at B.ICTs we haven't arrived at the time, but the poll that has been done is there are some people that are preferring that we either meet at lunchtime or after hours. So if it's after hours, it's going to be tricky for us to do this. Thanks. Bye. Have another class.
Sir, I've got a question.
So can I okay, what's the question? Because I'm transitioning to a different class.
So the coverage for the test is from which topic to which topic?
Yeah, I mean, so we're going to include everything that has not been included in the everything that was not included in test 1 all the way up to what we're covering right now, because by the time we're getting to by the time we're finalizing this, we'll probably have maybe about two weeks remaining before the test or something. So everything stuff that was not covered in test 1 all the way up to what we're doing right now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir.
But we have a month before the test. Bye.